Welcome to the Traveling Professors. I'm Professor Bob.
And I'm Professor Sherry.
And together we are
the Traveling Professors.
Welcome to show number 91 of the Traveling Professors. Today we're going to take a walking tour of Corinth. This is one of those half-a-day tours from Athens, which was pretty nice. I mean, basically they just took us to places, told us a couple of things about us, and then turned us loose to let us do our own thing. So we had plenty of time. The one issue that you have when you're in Corinth is Corinth was originally destroyed by the Romans around 146 BCE, and I mean it was completely destroyed. So under Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, they began a reconstruction, putting colonists here and redoing it. So it ultimately gets put back into place, but in a little bit different position. The main Agora and the main temple area remains, but the rest of the city shifted a little bit. So we're going to go to Corinth, we're going to go to the canal, the Corinth Canal, and then I'm going to show you some pictures and talk about Acrocorinth, which is actually the acropolis of Corinth, and that's where the temple of Aphrodite was located. Here's our map of the Saronic Gulf, and you'll see this again when we go down on our little boat trip to Hydra and Porus and Aegina. So we're going to leave from Athens, and we're going to go right around the rim up here of the northern part of the Saronic Gulf to Corinth. So we'll be in this area right through here, Corinth, its old port, canal, and Acrocorinth. To see it from another perspective, here it is with a modern highway map on it. You would just simply get on the nice green superhighway, toll road, goes right along the coast for the most spectacular view that you'll ever get of this area, and then across the Corinth Canal, and then you're into Corinth. So here we are leaving busy Athens, Corinth on the far left on the sign, spelled with a K in Greek, and all along the route we are running by the island of Salamis. So right out here in this area is where the great naval battle of Salamis took place, which defeated the Persian fleet. So this whole area, here's another shot. Salamis is a pretty large island, and as we get closer to the end, here you're starting to see the northern Peloponnesus, where you find Corinth. If you want to take a boat trip of the Salamis Strait to the island, there is a ferry that goes from Piraeus to the very north end of the island and back, and that would give you a spectacular view. And here's what the highway looks like that you're driving along on. It just runs right along the coast, and then you get closer to Corinth, you start seeing these smaller tankers. And one of the reasons these are smaller tankers is you're not going to be able to take that shortcut from the Saronic Gulf into the Gulf of Corinth unless your ship is pretty narrow. I mean, the gap there for the canal is only 25 meters wide. Right here is where the canal is located, and here's modern Corinth here, and then here is the ancient site, part of the ancient site. Remember, this is the temple area, so this whole region in here, particularly down to these various port areas, would all have been part of Corinth in ancient times. Let's look at the Canal of Corinth. Here's an aerial shot of it, quite from a distance, from a plane. And you can see this is the narrow between the Peloponnesian Peninsula and the rest of Greece. Here's a little better shot where you can see down at the lower edge, this is where most of the construction was done. This is where you come out into the Saronic Gulf. So it's the Saronic Gulf down here, and the bigger area is the Gulf of Corinth. Now this canal ends up being about 3 3/4 of a mile long, or 6 kilometers in length. 25 meters wide at the top and 21 meters at the bottom, and the water depth here is 8 meters. The Emperor Nero began work on it in 67 AD, but on his death that stopped, and work did not begin again until 1881, and then it was finished in 1898. And you can take tours through here. See, that's one of the things that Sherry and I have not done. And then here's a little better view showing the highways going across it. Now in ancient times, this distance didn't seem to be too much trouble, but you can imagine how frustrating it is for a captain who's in the Gulf of Corinth and he's planning to go to Athens, and he's going to have to sail all the way around the Peloponnesian Peninsula. So in ancient times, what they did is they built a road. It's called the Dalkos. And so you would come into the Gulf of Corinth. You could do it from both directions, okay? You come into the Gulf of Corinth, they would unload your ship, put that on wagons and mules, and then move it across land. and then they would put your ship on a carrier, so you would pull it, then it would cross the canal and then come up on the other side. Here's a little closer view of how the Dolkos, how it worked. And they found the excavations of it. Here's a picture of the part of the terrain along through here. It runs anywhere from 3 to 5.5 meters in width. Now this artist's drawing is a little bizarre, but it's the best I could find at this point, where you have this ship just kind of sitting on this device and the people are pulling it along. They had a flatbed device that you put the ship on, and they had animals as well as men moving it. You could really get across, but it's still pretty expensive. You can imagine the cost of lifting the ship out, dragging it across, and then moving your cargo. So there was quite a premium on that. Then here's another view showing the Doikos. And then here's what it looks like if you're on the bridge overlooking the cut. So here's one direction looking down. There's a little closer view of the railroad trestle. Here we are looking the other direction, and a little closer view, and that's a highway going the other direction. And they have a nice little spot here for you to cross. It's also a bungee jumping area. They have a sign that says, "This is if you're bungee jumping, this is the way you go." Almost every tour that we've taken that's gone into the Peloponnesian Peninsula has stopped here. I think I showed part of this when I did the trip to Mycenae and Epidaurus in one of my earlier shows. Anyway, that is the Corinth Canal. Now let's go down to the beach where St. Paul landed. Well, if there's one thing that everyone seems to know about Corinth, that is, this is a city that St. Paul the Apostle visited and converted the people. And we have the letters to the Corinthians, which I always find interesting because they're always trying to figure out a way to wiggle around with what they need to do. On our trip, they took us to the port that was there at the time of St. Paul the Apostle. So here we are after we left across the bridge over the canal. We were heading down to the old port, and it's called the harbor of Kenchreai. And here's a map of it, and you can see the drawings of where part of the harbor area was located. And if you take an aerial view, which you see here, you can see in the shallow areas where some of the harbor piers and things were located. And sometimes that's hard to do when you're down on ground level. So here we are at ground level. So we're coming along, and this is one of the edges of the pier. You can see a little bit better here, and you can see the other point right in this particular spot. And then ultimately we were able to get out, and they do have a viewing area. So here is the viewing area of that little landing zone. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but you have beaches and things all along this area, and the boats will, for the most part, will be dragged into the shallows and will just stay out in the water because they'll get waterlogged. And when you got a waterlogged ship, it's harder to row. So at least we went by the area where St. Paul landed, and then we headed off to Corinth. And one of the things that we're going to see, here we are on the highway, and you can see where it has the sign telling us where ancient Corinth is. We're going to get a look at this piece of rock here. You're familiar with the Acropolis in Athens. Well, this is the equivalent of that in Corinth. This is what is known as Acrocorinth. It is 575 meters high. It is a lot tougher walk up than it is to go up the Acropolis. But this area has been inhabited since about 5000 BCE, and the first settlement that they found was up on top of this, around 1000 BCE. So it's a pretty safe place to be up there. If you look at the map here you see Acrocorinth, and that is where the Temple of Aphrodite is located. So if you're wanting to go up and give money to the temple priestesses to have an evening or whatever with the temple prostitute, you're going to have to walk up from down on the bottom all the way up there. So you really got to work for your vices. So you see Acrocorinth, and then you see where we're headed, the other area where you have the religious zone, and then you see the Gulf of Corinth up at the top. And then this shows two fortification walls that were put across the isthmus. One of them was put when the Xerxes was coming in the Second Persian War, and then another one was then added later. So now we can just head off to Corinth. Here's an aerial view of the archaeological site. You can see the Temple of Apollo, and you see the museum down here on the very lower part. And then you have this large area, which is the Agora, and this little building up here, the upper right-hand corner that is known as the South Basilica. Here is a picture of what it would have looked like with its coverings and everything on it. So you see, this has been badly damaged over the years. There's 3 very major earthquakes that struck this before 500 AD, and of course it's attacked by invaders. Greece was hit pretty hard in the 3rd century and the 4th century by barbarians, so it took a lot of damage. And then of course this isn't excavated until into the late 1800s. 1800s. And then here's another chart, and this is the one I'm going to use as we travel through the site to give you an idea of what's going on. So we're going to come in and park somewhere where the word Corinth is. That's where they will let us out. Now, the auditoriums over here have not been fully excavated. And then we will walk up this direction and then go to the museum and see some things and then come back out. So after we get out of our bus and we move up, here is what is left of the amphitheaters. This area over here is just being worked on. They found lots of stone. They may put some of it together. Then as we come up closer to the museum, you see this little building right over here. That happens to be what is known as the Glauci Fountain. And then you can see the Temple of Apollo. And then we enter. It's a relatively small museum. And again, they just turned us loose on the site, told us how much time we had, and we just made it work. We did a little bit at the beginning, then saw the rest of the site, and then we had extra time. We came back and took more pictures. So here's an area, center of the museum, an open air section where they have some of the statues. And then you see some of the various types of pottery. And here is a display of glassware. Glassware, as I've always said before, is one of the hardest things to find because it gets shattered and destroyed. But here we have these magnificent examples. We have a toy horse. The horse is kind of the emblem of Corinth in ancient times. It was on the back of their coins. So it's a pull toy. You would put a little rope through its nose and then we would run around with it. And then there's all sorts of statues. Here's a set of statues, various gods, deities, because this is a very religious area as well as a tremendous economic port. So you have all kinds of wheeling and dealing in statues to take home for your own private sanctuary. There's a little bit of military there. Here's the famous bronze Corinthian helmet that was very popular in the Peloponnesian Peninsula and other places. Now this is also a site associated with healing. And when you go to healing sites, you will find statues of different types of deformities that people would point to show their illness or bring something to offer to the gods for healing. Here's the Naxian Sphinx, obviously associated with Apollo. We saw some of those on Delos, and this would have been one of the most magnificent bronze mirrors I've ever seen in a museum. And then we have some of the blackware that you find from Athens. And then, of course, they had all kinds of mosaics as well. So quite a nice little museum. So it's time to go out and start seeing the site. And here's our map of Corinth. So here's what we're going to do after we leave the museum. So we go out of the museum and we go by the fountain, and then we take a right, head towards Temple of Apollo, but that's going to be the last place that we visit. Then we're going to go down this direction and head out into the main Agora, and then go down this line of monuments and shrines to the Bema, and then turn around and get a view over the whole area. As we come out, we walk by the fountain of Glauci, and there is water in there. You can still see it. And then we'll walk by it, and this looking at the back side of it. And then here's a nice view of the front of the Temple of Apollo. And then we turn right and we start heading towards the Agora. So here's one road that leads between the outer edge of the temple area and down where the Agora is located. So you can see that these buildings along here, heading towards the tree on the right side, those are various temples dedicated to some of the local gods. And then we get out into the Agora, and we look out, and there again is the Temple of Apollo, one of our reference points, and the entrance to the temple enclosure. And then this is looking back towards the back end of the Agora, and behind it, behind this first line of temples and shrines, is what is known as the South Stoa. And then beyond that is what is called the South Basilica. Because remember, this city is rebuilt by Rome, so basilicas are used as places of courts of various types. And then, of course, you look behind the trees, and there is, of course, Acrocorinth. Now remember, this city would have gone up at its greatest height to the edge of this rise going up to the temple area. It would have gone all the way around it. So this is a much larger enclosure. So as we're going down the backside of the Agora, the main Agora, you see these little buildings. And here's the close-up of the very first one on the end, which is a little shrine. And then they have various shrines all along until you get to the center of it. Now, in the center of it is known as the Bema. Now, sometimes this is referred to as the rostra. There's also a little area in the middle of the Agora, which is the rostra. But this area would be where the leader of the city would come and speak. It's also believed to be one of the places that Paul may have preached to the people as well. And he may have also simply preached out in the middle of the Agora at the rostra. Now you can get up on the top of it. So here's a view of the area from the top of the rostra. So looking back to where we came, you see how large the Agora is. That's looking towards the museum. Then this is looking off the other direction, to the other side, and the final section of the Agora, and you'll see that there's a building that would have been right in here, and that would have been the Basilica of Julia. And then turning around and looking a little bit forward in front of the Bema, you're looking towards the main road that leads to Lexion, and that's where we're going to be headed next. But here's a view as we're heading closer to that walkway, another shot of the Temple of Apollo. And then here we are getting ready to start walking down to the road to see one of the entrance and exits to the city. Now this next section is relatively short because, as you can see, we're going to enter through here and go down the road, and we're going to look at the fountain and the other buildings or ruins on either side, and we'll come down to the area where you enter the city. This shows a semicircular building, but there's just ruins there. That semicircular building was the Odeon, which is where all of the daily business of the city took place. And then we'll walk back down the other direction and begin to work towards the Temple of Apollo. So here we are. We've just walked up to the top of the entrance from the Agora, and we can look down this really well-preserved street. On the right-hand side, you'll see all these people lining up on the staircase to go and see something. Well, what they're going to be looking at is called the Pyrrhen Fountain. And so here is a view from up there, because we got in line also. And you can see this spectacular area where the water comes out into this fountain and bath area. And then when we came down there, here's a nice view of it from directly in front. And then this is an artist's version of what it looked like. And I even found the little aerial view of this particular fountain. You can imagine what this was like when it was functioning. And then that's a view of the backside. So it was a very, they call it a fountain, but it was a pretty major building in the region. And then this whole expanse that you see here, part of that is known as the enclosure of Apollo, and at the other end is the baths of Eurydice. And so we walk down to the end, and so this is one of the parts of the baths, and you can see how bad a condition it is. And then there's a set of steps where if you went up the steps, you would walk out of the archaeological site. And they told us, one thing they told us, don't walk out of the archaeological site because you'll have to go back and get another ticket, and you can't get in this way. So you have to be pretty careful. I'm standing up there at the top of the steps looking back, and so you can see this magnificent street and the buildings on one side and the area on the other, and of course you look back and there's Acrocorinth. The size of this little archaeological dig, I mean, they'd have to move a lot of people. There's a lot, I mean, there's people living right on the edge of this. So to do a full excavation would be pretty expensive. Don't get the idea this is just some small little place. We don't even have where all the workers are, and this city would extend back down to the Gulf of Corinth, to the isthmus where they have people working. And then this is looking off to the right-hand side of the road that we're going to go back down. And these are some of the buildings that are associated with business and selling souvenirs of the temple. Everybody had temple souvenirs. Take a statue of Apollo home, or Apollo in his chariot. Well, it's finally time to see the Temple of Apollo. So we walk down the road and we take a right, and you don't go into the enclosure like you would have in ancient times. You come back to where we started, and then we walk this entire area all the way around, getting pictures from different directions. So here we are going down the street, back the other direction. So here is a side view of part of the platform where the temple is built on. Now, the temple was originally built in 550 BCE. However, there are ruins underneath it that go back another 150 to 200 years. Then once we've made our turn, then we walk all the way back down to where we started when we came in. So this is the look down all of the buildings and structures on the one side of the Agora. And then finally we climb up on the platform, and here's the beautiful surviving columns. Now the temple itself, its largest platform, which is the stylobate, and there are actually 3 of those, the one on the bottom and then there's 2 up above it. It's 53.82 meters long and 21.48 meters wide. So roughly 160 plus feet in one direction and 63 or 64 feet the other direction. And the columns are 3.5 meters high. So you're looking at almost 12 feet. So we walked all the way down to the back of it, so you can see the whole length of it. Then here is, of course, Acrocorinth is just too good of a picture not to keep taking it. And she wasn't shy like Mount Vesuvius was when I took pictures of it where it had cloud cover on it. So you see the temple and then Acrocorinth, where the temple of Aphrodite was located, which would have put this temple to shame. And then you can look from this platform and see out to the Gulf. And then this is a view looking towards the Agora. And then this is a view the other direction. This is the area where you would have had another temple. You would have had what is known as the North Agora and other buildings. And then further away, you would have had the amphitheaters. And then here's a view of the little enclosure at which you would have come in originally. And then going back, take another look at the temple. And as you can see, this is in the afternoon. Around noonish, 2 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon was our time we were here. And so different times of the day you'll get different lighting. And I like the lighting at this particular time. There's a little closer shot of the columns. And then we go back to the museum area. We go back by the Glauque fountain. There's a view from the parking lot where we're headed to get on our buses to leave. Now, one of the things that we didn't get to do, and that was to go up to Acrocorinth. I couldn't find a tour that did that. I think you have to get a private guide to go up there. I don't know how far you can drive up. You may end up having to do a great deal of walking. So at any rate, here's a couple of views of Acrocorinth that I found. You can see it's been fortified. This is the place where, when the city's attacked, everybody gathered their goods up and marched up to the top of this thing. It's pretty much impregnable. Now, it did have its walls breached once, and that was done by Demetrius, the son of Antigonus Monothelmus. Antigonus the One-Eyed, one of the generals of Alexander the Great. And his son Demetrius was known as the Demetrius the City Slayer. And he had special catapults and battering rams and this tower that had multiple catapults built in it. And I think he was successful in taking Acrocorinth. Here's a closer view of the various defenses. This place was used until the middle of the Middle Ages. So you do have some fortifications that were modernized during the Middle Ages. If you did walk up, this is the walkway that you would see to get into the city. However, when you get up to the top, it's basically just ruins. There's an area which they call, this is where the temple of Aphrodite sat, but it's basically just ruins. In that video game that I played on ancient Greece, this is how they rendered the temple of Aphrodite up there. And your character walks up this and walks down it and all sorts of different things. Now, the advantage of going up here, though, is pretty obvious. Look at the view. This is a view from one of the towers on the wall, and you can see this plain area down below and then out to the Gulf of Corinth. This is a little from another spot with a little telephoto lens, and you can see the archaeological site down below. You can see it's not that far from where the archaeological site is to the Gulf of Corinth. So that's Acrocorinth, and I hope you enjoyed the trip up here to Corinth. It's well worth a half a day to go and visit this. Sherry and I hope you enjoyed the tour. Please come by our YouTube channel at Bob Packett, and please subscribe and leave some comments. Thank you very much. I've been doing podcasting on history for over 15 years. I've got over 4,000 shows, and I've done CDs, which of course can be sent out as USBs. So if you would really like to get more on history for free, then come by my website, as you see here, historyaccordingtobob.com, and see what's there. So thank you very much again.